Hello. So I'm currently reorganizing my entire studio setup, and I wanted to talk about the audio routing. I've already made a video about my MIDI setup, and the one thing that I've done that's a little bit different from most is I've decided to use stereo signal throughout the entire setup. So from the mixer, Patchbay is set up as a stereo system, which I'll talk about. The cabling for every single synth, all of my effects are stereo. I'll also talk about how I'm wiring everything to make this work. So let's look at how the audio works for my studio setup. Alright, so if the core of my MIDI setup is the sequencer, it makes sense the audio routing starts with the mixers. This is the Allenf&Heath Xone 23C. It's an analog 2-channel DJ mixer with the usual 3-band EQ, a really nice analog filter, and an external effects loop. The C in 23C means it's also an audio interface with 2 stereo inputs and 2 stereo outputs. But the cool part is its inputs, because each channel has a phono line input, a second line input, and finally the digital input, each with individual gain control. But before we plug anything into the inputs, let's talk about the outputs. The Xone 23C has 4 separate outputs: master, monitor, headphones, and record, with separate volume control on everything except the record out. Alright, so I have my PreSonus Eris 5 plugged into the master out. Those are my main studio monitors. I also have those red Scandina micropods in the monitor out, and I just got this pair of Avantone Planar Pro headphones, which sounds fantastic, by the way. Obviously 2 or even 4 analog inputs are not going to be enough. This is where the ART MX822 line mixer comes in. So it has 8 stereo inputs, each with volume, pan, and sun control, a dedicated effects return with gain, and all of that in a tiny 1U rack. But the best thing is the link feature, so my 2 units can act as a single 16-channel mixer and still share the same effects loop, which in my case is the Lexicon MX300, which I use as my main reverb. I find that even the smallest amount of reverb send can help anchor an instrument in space. Also, since we're talking about what's in the rack, this is the PreSonus ACP88. It's an 8-channel analog compressor and gate. I'm using 2 of the 8 channels as a stereo master compressor before sending the result to channel A of the DJ mixer. I'm using the other master out from the line mixer to go into my Korg KP3+ that I use as a master bus effects, looper, and mangler on channel B of the DJ mixer. Alright, here comes the fun part. The Patchbays. In my case, stereo Patchbays. Obviously, there's no such thing as a stereo Patchbay, but Patchbays are TRS, which means tip, ring, sleeve. And there are 3 main types of TRS signals. Balanced, with the signal on tip, reverse phase on ring, and ground on the sleeve. Insert, with the send on tip, return on ring, and ground on the sleeve. And finally, stereo, with the left on tip, right on ring, and the ground is always the sleeve. Oh, a good mnemonic to remember all of this: red, ring, reverse, return, right. So everything starts with R. Alright, so back to my Patchbay. Stereo Patchbays. By using TRS stereo signals everywhere, every patch point is either a stereo source or a stereo destination, making routing very simple. And I can still take advantage of normal and semi-normal connections. In a Patchbay, the top and bottom patch point works as a pair. Usually the top is an output and the bottom the corresponding input. In a normal connection, the input is connected to the output by default, but that connection is broken if a cable is inserted into the top or bottom patch point. In half normal mode, the connection is only broken when patching the bottom connector, so you can send the same signal to both the default and a new destination. The third mode is true, with no default connections at all. Alright, so because of my everything is a stereo signal setup, I have to convert every device to and from a TRS stereo cable. The first case is for devices that already have a stereo connector, like the 1010 Music Blackbox. For those, a single TRS to TRS cable or TRS to mini TRS works. But most stereo devices will have separate left and right connectors. Those can use a standard insert cable that splits TRS into 2 separate TS jacks. Or in the case of DJ gears, TRS to dual RCA. Mono devices get upgraded to dual mono. with the same signal sent to the tip and ring or left and right channels. But the weirdest case is for devices that have a separate TRS send return for the left and right channel, like the sidechain input on my stereo compressors. Those need to be converted from left and right insert to separate stereo send and stereo return to be compatible with my stereo Patchbay setup. Those are obviously custom cables, but they're simple enough to build. So after all of this, what do I have plugged into the Patchbay? Well, the first Patchbay is mostly the mixers and synths. The first 16 inputs are half normaled into the mixer, which allows me to split the signal from a synth, keep it in the mixer, and send it to an effects patch as well. So those are the O-Coast, Model D, Hydronium, Nix, Preen FM2, my MicroMonsta, Blofeld, and Modor. Then an instrument DI for guitar and bass, MU80, Nord Drum, Tanzbär Lite, MFB 301 or 501 Pro, Paolo's Nitro Mesh Kit, Deluge, and the Blackbox Output 1, which all go into the second set of mixer inputs. Then there's the other Blackbox outputs, as well as the Blackbox and Deluge inputs, and a few synths that don't have a dedicated mixer input, like the MicroGranny and Meeblip Triode. The second Patchbay is for effects unit, or things that can be used as effects unit with stereo inputs and stereo outputs. So ESPI is a convolution reverb unit, the Bastl THYME, the Hydronium effects loop, Nix reverb input, both of which are not stereo, two effects pedals, the Nux Mod Force and Time Force, the Korg NTS1, and the Gecho Loopsynth. Then we have Axoloti, the Xone external effects loop, and the secondary line input for the Xone 23C. And finally, all of the compressors set as stereo pairs with their sidechain loops, the Alesis 3630, and the remaining 3 pairs from the PreSonus ACP88. And that completes the second Patchbay. Alright, so I still have a lot of work to do to rewire everything, but I wanted to make this video to talk a little bit about how my little studio setup is wired. I hope that you guys got something out of it. The main point is I want everything to be fully accessible at all time. The idea is to remove friction when it comes to being creative, so I can come here, sit down, flick one switch, everything turns on, everything is sort of pre-wired, ready to go, but I can still go through the Patchbay and reorganize things whichever way I want. And the other point is I went with the stereo Patchbay and stereo throughout setup because stereo is a superset, right? You can actually carry a mono signal through a stereo cable. You can't do it the other way around. So for the few synths and effects that I have that are fully mono, I just set them up as dual mono and it still works within the grand scheme of things. Anyway, so that's all I have for today. I'm gonna spend this weekend rewiring everything and putting everything back into working order, and I'll see you on the next video. Merci, au revoir. Bye.